Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into one of the most familiar empires in history, but from a much quieter angle. Not the battlefield, not the Senate floor, and not the grand speeches that usually define Rome. Instead, we're looking at the rhythm of an ordinary Roman day and how that rhythm helps explain the rise of an entire civilization. Because once you strip away the marble statues and the military victories, what really made Rome powerful was routine, discipline, habit, and the shared structure of daily life. And before we begin, if you enjoy thoughtful long-form history like this, consider subscribing. A lot of regular listeners do, simply so they can keep finding calm, well-researched stories that slow things down and make the ancient world feel a little clearer. To understand a Roman daily routine, we need to begin with one simple truth. There was no single Roman day that applied equally to everyone. Rome was a vast society spread across centuries, and daily life looked different depending on whether you were rich or poor, free or enslaved, male or female, living in the city of Rome or in a provincial town far from Italy. Even so, there were broad patterns that shaped ordinary experience, especially during the height of the Roman world. When people imagine Roman life, they often picture emperors, generals, senators, and gladiators. But most Romans did not live at the center of great events. They woke early, ate modestly, worked hard, dealt with family obligations, visited markets, managed social expectations, and moved through a city whose daily pulse was astonishingly organized. The Roman world was famous for law, roads, and military order, but those large systems rested on countless small routines repeated every day. For many Romans, the day began at first light. Artificial lighting existed, but it was weak and costly compared with daylight, so life naturally followed the sun far more closely than in the modern world. In the city of Rome, dawn arrived with noise. Streets could already be busy with footsteps. Carts were permitted, street vendors, laborers, servants, and clients heading toward the houses of wealthy patrons. If you lived in a crowded apartment block, known as an insula, your morning might begin in a cramped upper room with limited privacy, little insulation, and all the sounds of neighbors waking around you. These buildings housed much of the urban population and varied in quality. Some were fairly respectable, while others were dangerously built, vulnerable to fire, and uncomfortable in heat or cold. For poorer Romans, waking up was not a peaceful ritual of private comfort. It was often immediate, practical, and tied to survival. A simple breakfast usually came first, though it was not the large morning meal many people expect today. The Romans often called it the ientaculum. For ordinary people, it could be bread, perhaps dipped in wine, maybe olives, cheese, leftovers, or porridge depending on means and location. Wealthier households had more options, of course, but even then breakfast tended to be modest compared with the later main meal. Roman food culture was deeply shaped by class. Elite writers sometimes described luxury in great detail, but the average Roman diet relied on staples: grain, bread, legumes, oil, and whatever else was accessible. In the city, one of the most important supports of daily life was grain distribution. For many residents of Rome, access to grain was not just convenient. It was essential. The Roman state understood very clearly that feeding the capital was a political necessity. A city that large could not remain calm if its bread supply failed. After waking and eating, the routines of class became especially visible. In elite households, the early morning often centered on the salutatio, the formal greeting between a patron and his clients. This was one of the small but powerful rituals that held Roman society together. Men of lower status would visit a wealthier or more influential patron, pay their respects, and reinforce a relationship built on obligation, loyalty, and advantage. To modern eyes, it can look purely transactional, and in many ways it was, but Romans considered it normal social structure. Influence was personal. Networks mattered. Favors mattered. Recommendation mattered. A Roman patron was expected to offer support, legal help, access, or food gifts in some cases, while clients offered public respect, attendance, and political usefulness. So when the morning streets filled with men moving toward aristocratic houses, Rome was not simply waking up. Its hierarchy was physically coming to life. Inside those wealthy homes, the domus, the difference from ordinary urban life could be dramatic. An elite Roman house was not just a residence. It was a public statement. Its layout announced status. Visitors might pass through an atrium, see family images, observe domestic order, and understand immediately that this household had standing. But even there, routine was not relaxed in the modern sense. The Roman elite were deeply concerned with dignity, appearance, duty, and time. A senator or magistrate might spend the morning receiving visitors, handling correspondence, discussing legal matters, overseeing estates through agents, or preparing for business in the forum. The household itself ran through the labor of enslaved people, secretaries, tutors, cooks, cleaners, and attendants, each of whom had their own routine, often far harsher and more demanding than that of the family they served. That contrast is one of the most important things to remember when talking about Roman daily life. The Roman world functioned through inequality so ordinary that many Romans barely questioned it. Enslaved people were present in homes, workshops, farms, baths, mines, and households across the empire. Some worked in skilled positions and could develop a degree of trust or responsibility. Others endured exhausting labor with very little protection. Their daily routines were not their own. They woke when told, worked where ordered, and lived under the authority of masters whose power was deeply embedded in Roman law and culture. Any honest description of Roman routine has to include that reality. The comfort of the Roman upper classes, and even much of the convenience of urban life, rested on the labor of people who did not control their own time. Meanwhile, for craftsmen, traders, shopkeepers, porters, builders, clerks, and laborers, the morning was the true beginning of work. Roman streets were lined with small shops and workshops, many opening directly onto the road. A single space might serve as both workplace and point of sale, with living quarters behind or above it. Bakers began early because bread was central to daily diet. Metalworkers, dyers, fullers, cobblers, and sellers of oil, wine, fish sauce, cloth, lamps, or pottery all formed part of the urban economy. The Roman city was not silent stone. It was active, crowded, and commercial. Smells of baking, animals, smoke, sewage, perfume, olive oil, and street food mixed together. Sound was everywhere. Hammering, shouting, bargaining, and traffic created a city that was far more alive and less polished than the elegant ruins suggest now. The Forum often stood at the center of this world, not only as a political space but as a practical one. Business was discussed there, cases were argued, announcements made, money handled, and reputations formed. Roman daily life was public in ways that modern life often is not. A person's standing was constantly reinforced through visibility. Who you walked with, who greeted you where you sat, how you dressed, and whose support you had could all shape your place in society. Clothing mattered here. The toga, so strongly associated with Rome, was real and important, but it was not everyday wear for all occasions in the way popular culture sometimes implies. It could be formal, cumbersome, and closely tied to citizenship and status. Most practical daily clothing was simpler. Tunics were common. Work required mobility. Rome admired dignity, but daily life still demanded usefulness. Women's routines, too, varied sharply by class. In elite households, women could oversee domestic management, supervise enslaved workers, arrange marriages, handle certain financial matters, and maintain the dignity of the family household. Although Roman society was strongly patriarchal, women in wealthy families were not always invisible, and some exercised real influence, especially within kinship networks and property arrangements. In more ordinary settings, women worked in shops, markets, textile production, household tasks, food preparation, childcare, and a wide range of labor essential to family survival. The Roman household was an economic unit as much as a private one. Daily life was rarely divided neatly into modern categories of home and work. Much of life happened in the same shared spaces, with family, business, service, and obligation constantly overlapping. Children, too, followed routines shaped by status. Some boys, especially from affluent families, might be educated by tutors or attend lessons in reading, writing, rhetoric, and literature, because education was tied to ambition and public life. Girls in elite families could also receive education, though usually with more limits and different expectations. For poorer families, children often entered work early, assisting in trades, domestic tasks, and family businesses. Roman childhood was not built around prolonged protection from adult responsibility. From an early age, children were being prepared for the roles society expected them to fill. Even play, when it appeared in surviving sources and objects, existed alongside a culture that valued discipline, authority, and readiness. By the middle of the day, Rome had already been active for hours. The early part of the morning was often considered the most useful time for serious business. As heat increased, especially in warmer months, the tempo could shift. A lighter meal around midday, sometimes called the prandium, might be taken quickly. It was often less formal than the evening meal and could include bread, fruit, cold meat, vegetables, or leftovers. For many working people, there was little luxury in this pause. It was simply fuel for the rest of the day. But the structure matters. Romans did not organize their time exactly as modern industrial societies do. They did not divide the day with the same fixed clock discipline that became common much later. Hours existed, of course, but Roman hours changed with the seasons because they measured daylight differently. This meant that time itself was experienced in a more flexible, more natural rhythm, even within a civilization famous for order. As the morning moved toward afternoon, the energy of the Roman city began to shift slightly. The most urgent business of the day was often completed early, especially for people involved in politics, administration, or legal matters. By the later hours of the day, many Romans began turning their attention towards something that outsiders often find surprising in its importance: the public baths. To modern observers, Roman baths might sound like a luxury or occasional leisure activity, but in reality, they were a central part of daily life for many people in Roman cities. Bath complexes existed in neighborhoods across the empire, from small local bathhouses to enormous imperial complexes that could hold thousands of visitors at a time. These buildings were not just about washing the body. They were social spaces, places where business conversations happened, friendships were maintained, and news circulated through the community. For many Romans, visiting the baths was part of an almost predictable routine. After finishing work or daily obligations, people would head toward the bathhouse carrying a small bundle of personal items, perhaps oil, a towel, or a scraping tool known as a strigil. Unlike modern bathing, Roman washing did not rely on soap. Instead, bathers covered their skin with oil and then scraped away dirt and sweat with the curved metal strigil. The process sounds unusual today, but it was highly effective and widely practiced throughout Roman society. The experience of the baths followed a general sequence of rooms. Visitors often began in a changing room known as the apoditerium, where clothing was stored. From there, they might pass into a warm room called the tepidarium, allowing the body to adjust gradually to heat. The hotter chamber, the caldarium, contained hot water pools and steam that opened the pores and relaxed the muscles. Finally, many bathers ended the process with a plunge into the frigidarium, a cold water basin that closed the pores and refreshed the body. What made these baths remarkable was not just their comfort, but the engineering behind them. Roman bathhouses relied on an advanced heating system known as the hypocaust. Beneath the floors, hot air from furnaces circulated through hollow spaces supported by small pillars, warming the rooms above. Walls often contained flues that carried heat upward, allowing entire chambers to remain comfortably hot. The result was a bathing experience that required impressive technical planning and constant labor from workers who maintained fires and water supplies throughout the day. But the baths were more than an engineering achievement. They were one of the few places where different levels of Roman society could mix in relatively close proximity. Although certain bathhouses catered more to wealthy visitors and some charged entrance fees, many baths were affordable for ordinary citizens. Inside these spaces, men discussed politics, athletes exercised, philosophers debated ideas, and merchants arranged deals. It was one of the most socially dynamic environments in the Roman world. Alongside bathing, many complexes included exercise yards known as palaestri. Here visitors might engage in wrestling, ball games, stretching, or light training before entering the baths themselves. Physical activity was considered part of maintaining a healthy body, though Roman attitudes toward exercise differed from the intense athletic culture of classical Greece. For most Romans, the goal was balance and well-being rather than competition. By late afternoon, as bathhouses filled and the heat of the day softened, Rome itself seemed to pause slightly from its earlier rush. Streets were still busy, markets still open, but the mood began shifting toward the evening. And in Roman culture, evening meant something important was approaching. The main meal of the day, known as the cena. As evening approached, the rhythm of Roman life gradually shifted toward the most important meal of the day. Unlike modern societies where breakfast or lunch might be substantial, the Roman cena was the true centerpiece of daily eating. For many households, this meal was not rushed. It was an event that reflected family structure, social status, and the cultural values of the Roman world. For poorer families, the evening meal remained simple but filling. Bread was still the foundation, often accompanied by vegetables, lentils, olives, or small portions of fish if available. Cheese and eggs were common sources of protein, and wine diluted with water was the standard drink for adults. Meat was less common for the lower classes and was usually eaten only on special occasions or during public festivals when food distributions sometimes occurred. Despite its simplicity, the evening meal brought together members of the household after a long day of work. In wealthier homes, however, the cena could become a carefully structured social gathering. Elite Romans sometimes invited friends, political allies, or clients to dine with them, turning the meal into an opportunity for networking and reputation building. Dining rooms, called triclinia, were designed specifically for this purpose. Guests reclined on cushioned couches arranged around a low central table, leaning on one arm while eating with the other. This reclining style was borrowed centuries earlier from Greek customs and had become a defining feature of elite Roman dining culture. Meals in wealthy households could unfold in several courses. The first stage, sometimes called the gustatio, often included lighter foods such as eggs, salads, shellfish, or small appetizers. This was followed by the main course, which might feature roasted meats, fish dishes, vegetables, and sauces that demonstrated the host's access to ingredients and skilled cooks. Finally came desserts, including fruit, nuts, pastries, or honey-based sweets. Roman cookbooks that survive today suggest a wide range of flavors, often combining sweet, sour, and savory ingredients in ways that might surprise modern tastes. Yet the meal itself was only part of the experience. Conversation played an important role. Guests discussed politics, literature, philosophy, and the latest news from the empire. For elite Romans, the dinner table was another stage where education and cultural refinement could be displayed. Hosts sometimes arranged entertainment as well. Musicians, poets, or performers might appear during the meal, and elaborate tableware signaled wealth and prestige. While elite dinners could stretch for hours, the majority of Romans lived much more modestly. In crowded apartment districts, families ate in small rooms with limited furniture. Cooking facilities were often basic, and many people purchased prepared food from street vendors or neighborhood cookshops. Archaeological evidence from cities like Pompeii shows numerous small food counters where hot meals could be bought by people who lacked full kitchens at home. These establishments served stews, bread, wine, and other affordable dishes, making them an essential part of urban life. As darkness settled over the city, daily routines slowly came to a close. Roman streets did not remain brightly lit through the night. Oil lamps provided limited illumination, but once the sun disappeared, movement outside became more difficult and sometimes less safe. Most people returned to their homes, where the final hours of the evening were quieter and more private. Inside households, small lamps flickered against painted walls, casting warm light across rooms that had been busy all day. Families talked, finished simple tasks, or prepared for the next morning. Children went to sleep early, and adults followed soon after. Because the Roman day began with sunrise, rest was necessary before the cycle began again. This pattern, early rising, work through the morning, bathing and social life in the afternoon, and communal meals in the evening, created a daily rhythm that repeated across much of the Roman world. It was a rhythm that connected millions of people, from the crowded streets of Rome itself to distant provincial towns scattered across Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East. And through that shared rhythm, the Roman Empire functioned not just as a political structure, but as a living society built on countless ordinary days. As night settled fully over the city, Rome entered a quieter phase of its daily rhythm. Without modern lighting, the darkness of evening was far more complete than what most urban residents experience today. Oil lamps flickered in homes and along certain streets, but the city did not glow with constant illumination. For many Romans, night was a time for rest rather than extended activity. The next day would begin early again, and the routines that sustained Roman life depended on predictable cycles of work and sleep. Inside ordinary homes and crowded apartment buildings, the final hours of the evening were practical and calm. Families might finish small domestic tasks that had been delayed during the busy daylight hours. Clothing could be repaired, tools prepared for the following morning, or simple food stored for the next day's breakfast. Roman households were not passive spaces. They functioned as small economic units, and even the quietest moments of the evening often involved preparation for the work that would return with sunrise. Sleep itself was simpler than modern expectations might suggest. Beds were typically wooden frames fitted with rope or woven supports, topped with mattresses stuffed with wool, straw, or feathers depending on wealth. In poorer households, the arrangements were much more basic, sometimes little more than mats or simple bedding on the floor. Privacy was also limited, especially in urban apartment blocks where multiple family members often shared the same room. The Roman concept of domestic comfort existed, but it was shaped by conditions that modern audiences would find crowded and noisy. While many people went to bed early, the night was not entirely silent. Certain types of work took place after dark. Bakers sometimes prepared bread overnight so it would be ready for sale at dawn. Guards, watchmen, and patrols moved through the streets to maintain order. Inns and taverns continued operating for travelers or late visitors. In some areas, Carts transporting goods were allowed to move more freely at night because daytime traffic restrictions made movement through the city difficult. This meant that while much of Rome slept, parts of the urban system continued operating quietly in the background. Religious life also remained present within the rhythm of the Roman day. Romans lived in a culture deeply shaped by ritual and respect for the gods. Small household shrines known as lararia were common features inside many homes. These shrines honored protective household spirits called the Laras and Penates. Families might pause during the day, or sometimes in the evening, to offer small prayers, incense, or food offerings. These rituals were usually simple, but they reinforced a powerful idea within Roman culture, that daily life existed under the watch of divine forces. Public religion operated alongside these private rituals. Throughout the year, Rome's calendar contained numerous festivals dedicated to gods, historical victories, or agricultural cycles. On festival days, the routine of ordinary work could shift. Markets might close, games could be held, temples became crowded with visitors, and public ceremonies reminded citizens of their shared traditions. But on most days, religion blended quietly into everyday routines rather than interrupting them dramatically. One of the striking features of Roman daily life is how structured it was without depending on modern systems of timekeeping. Mechanical clocks did not govern the Roman world. Instead, time was often measured through sundials and water clocks, and daylight hours were divided into 12 parts that changed length depending on the season. This meant that a Roman hour during summer could be noticeably longer than one during winter. People adapted naturally to these shifts because their activities were tied more closely to the movement of the sun than to a fixed numerical schedule. Over time, these daily habits created something larger than routine. They produced social stability. When millions of people share similar rhythms, waking early, working through the morning, gathering in public spaces, bathing in the afternoon, dining with family or friends in the evening, the result is a predictable pattern that holds a society together. In Rome's case, this shared pattern stretched across an empire that eventually covered enormous distances. A merchant in Spain, a farmer in North Africa, and a craftsman in Italy might live very different lives, but the broad structure of their days often followed recognizable Roman customs. They used Roman roads, traded with Roman coins, followed Roman laws, and participated in traditions that tied them to a much larger cultural system. Daily routine became one of the quiet forces that allowed Rome to function as more than just a political authority. Yet these routines were never completely identical. Local traditions, regional foods, climate differences, and economic conditions shaped how each community lived its Roman day. The empire was vast and diverse, and daily life always blended Roman practices with older regional customs. What historians see, therefore, is not a single rigid schedule but a shared framework that could adapt to many environments. And perhaps that is the most revealing part of Roman daily life. The empire is often remembered for dramatic events, wars, emperors, rebellions, and monumental architecture. But those extraordinary moments rested on the ordinary repetition of everyday habits. Bread baked before dawn, markets opened, patrons received visitors, workers filled the streets. When we step back and look at the Roman daily routine as a whole, it becomes clear that these ordinary patterns were not accidental. Roman society valued order, discipline, and continuity, and those values were reinforced every single day through routine behavior. From the earliest hours of the morning to the quiet darkness of night, Romans participated in a rhythm that shaped how they understood responsibility, status, and community. One of the reasons this routine mattered so much is that Rome was an enormous and complicated society. At its height, the Roman world stretched across 3 continents, incorporating dozens of cultures, languages, and traditions. Governing such a vast territory required more than armies and laws. It required shared expectations about how daily life should function. The habits learned in childhood, respect for authority, attention to duty, participation in social networks, helped maintain stability across the empire. For Roman men of the elite classes, daily routine reinforced the idea of public service and reputation. A senator or magistrate did not simply perform occasional political tasks. Much of his day was spent maintaining relationships that allowed political power to exist. Greeting clients, visiting the forum, discussing legal matters, attending public events. These activities formed part of a continuous performance of responsibility. Roman writers often emphasized that honor and dignity, what they called dignitas, had to be protected through visible action. Routine interactions were therefore not trivial. They were essential to maintaining social standing. For ordinary citizens, routine created predictability in a world that could otherwise feel uncertain. Work provided structure. Markets ensured access to food and goods. Public baths offered both cleanliness and social connection. Even the regular appearance of festivals and religious ceremonies provided moments of shared identity that reminded people they belonged to something larger than their household or neighborhood. The Roman city itself was carefully designed to support this rhythm of life. Roads connected neighborhoods and allowed movement of goods. Aqueducts supplied enormous quantities of fresh water that fed fountains, baths, and households. Public spaces such as forums, temples, and marketplaces provided locations where daily routines could unfold. When historians study Roman infrastructure, they often focus on the impressive engineering. But just as important is how that infrastructure made everyday routines possible for large populations. Consider water alone. Without aqueducts delivering constant supplies, the bathing culture that defined Roman urban life would have been impossible. The same water systems also supported fountains where residents could collect drinking water, as well as latrines and drainage systems that helped keep the city functioning. In this way, engineering and daily routine were closely connected. Roman technological achievements were not only symbols of power, they were practical tools that shaped how people lived hour by hour. Education also played a role in sustaining Roman routine across generations. Boys in elite families were often trained in rhetoric, literature, and law, preparing them for public careers. But education was not purely academic. It taught cultural expectations. Students read works that emphasized moral discipline, loyalty to the state, and admiration for earlier Roman heroes. In this way, each generation absorbed the same values that had shaped earlier citizens. Even those who did not receive formal schooling still learned social expectations through family life, apprenticeships, and daily observation of public behavior. Yet the Roman daily routine also reveals the limits and tensions of the empire. Not everyone benefited equally from its systems. Enslaved individuals worked long hours with little personal freedom. Laborers and urban poor faced difficult living conditions in crowded housing. Rural farmers could struggle with unpredictable harvests and heavy taxation. The order of Roman society existed alongside inequality that modern observers often find striking. Even so, what allowed the Roman world to endure for centuries was the persistence of its everyday structures. Empires rise and fall through political events, but they survive through ordinary habits repeated across millions of lives. Every Roman day, waking at dawn, working through the morning, gathering in public spaces, sharing meals in the evening, reinforced a shared understanding of how society should function. When we imagine ancient Rome today, it is easy to picture dramatic scenes. Soldiers marching across distant frontiers, emperors issuing commands, grand temples rising above the skyline. Those images are real parts of Roman history, but they represent only a small portion of what the empire actually was. Most of Rome existed in quieter moments, in the smell of fresh bread drifting from a bakery before sunrise, in the crowded conversations of the bathhouse in the late afternoon, in the flicker of a small oil lamp as a family finished its evening meal. These were the countless ordinary scenes that filled the days of millions of people. And in the end, it was those ordinary days, repeated again and again across generations, that sustained one of the most influential civilizations the world has ever known. If we slow down even further and look closely at the details of a Roman day, we begin to notice how deeply time, space, and social expectation shaped every small action. A Roman did not simply wake up and decide what the day might hold. Much of the structure was already understood by everyone around them. From childhood, people learned where they belonged in society, how they were expected to behave, and how each part of the day naturally unfolded. Take clothing, for example. Something as simple as getting dressed in the morning reflected Roman social order. The basic garment for most people was the tunic, a simple piece of cloth worn by men, women, and children. But small differences in material, decoration, and color could signal important distinctions. Wealthier citizens wore finer fabrics and carefully tailored garments. Senators had distinctive stripes on their clothing that marked their rank. The famous Roman toga, although uncomfortable and difficult to wear, served as a powerful symbol of citizenship and public identity. When worn in the streets or the forum, it communicated dignity, responsibility, and belonging to the Roman civic world. These visual signals mattered because Roman society was highly public and observational. Much of life happened outside the privacy of the home. Streets, markets, baths, and public squares were constantly filled with people watching, greeting, negotiating, and interacting. Reputation was built slowly through these daily encounters. A person who appeared reliable, respectful, and socially connected could gain influence over time. Someone who ignored expected customs risked losing trust and status. Transportation within the city also followed its own routine patterns. Rome's streets were often crowded, narrow, and busy with foot traffic. During the day, heavy carts were restricted in certain areas because they could cause serious congestion. As a result, many goods moved at night when the streets were less crowded. This unusual rule meant that nighttime Rome sometimes echoed with the sound of wagon wheels and animals moving supplies across the city. Writers from the ancient world occasionally complained about the noise, suggesting that even in the quiet hours, the city's economic life never completely stopped. Communication traveled through equally ordinary channels. News spread through conversation in markets, announcements in the forum, public inscriptions, and word of mouth carried from neighborhood to neighborhood. Without newspapers or digital communication, information moved at the pace of human interaction. A new law, an imperial decree, or a rumor about political events might circulate gradually through daily gatherings at shops or bathhouses. In this way, everyday routine also functioned as the empire's informal communication network. Food markets played a particularly important role in sustaining this daily life. Fresh produce, grains, fish, olive oil, and spices arrived from across the Mediterranean world. Ships unloaded goods at Roman ports, and merchants transported them into the city where vendors sold them in lively marketplaces. For ordinary residents, visiting the market was not just about purchasing food. It was a social event, a chance to hear news, exchange greetings, and observe the movement of the wider economy. Seasonal change also shaped the Roman routine more than it does for many people today. Summers in Italy could be intensely hot, which meant activities shifted earlier in the day when possible. During winter, daylight was shorter and cooler temperatures changed the pace of outdoor work. Agricultural communities especially adjusted their routines to match the rhythm of planting, harvesting, and caring for animals. Although the empire included large cities, a significant portion of the population still lived in rural environments where daily life followed the cycles of the land. Even leisure had its place within the Roman routine. While the baths provided relaxation and conversation, other forms of entertainment also appeared regularly. Public spectacles in theaters, chariot races in large arenas, and occasional gladiatorial games drew enormous crowds. These events did not occur every single day, but when they did, they could transform the city's atmosphere. People gathered early, discussed favorite competitors, and filled the stands of massive venues designed to hold tens of thousands of spectators. Yet even these dramatic moments eventually faded back into the ordinary rhythm of Roman life. The crowd would disperse, vendors would pack up their goods, and families would return home through the same streets they walked every day. Lamps would be lit, doors closed, and another evening would settle across the rooftops of the city. Seen from a distance, these countless routines might appear simple, but together they formed the invisible structure of Roman civilization. The empire's armies, laws, and architecture often capture our attention, yet they depended on something quieter. Millions of people repeating the same patterns of work, rest, and social interaction, day after day. And through that repetition, Rome endured for centuries, sustained not only by power, but by the steady rhythm of ordinary life. Another important part of the Roman daily routine, especially in large cities like Rome, Pompeii, or Ostia, was the constant presence of public infrastructure. Unlike many earlier civilizations, Rome invested enormous resources into building systems that supported everyday life. Roads, aqueducts, drainage channels, fountains, and public buildings were not simply monuments. They were tools that allowed millions of people to live and move through dense urban spaces. Water was perhaps the most remarkable of these systems. Roman aqueducts carried fresh water from distant hills into cities using carefully calculated gradients. Once the water arrived, it flowed into reservoirs and then spread through networks of pipes to fountains, baths, and sometimes private homes. For ordinary Romans, the public fountain was often the center of neighborhood life. People came throughout the day to collect water for cooking, washing, and drinking. These small gatherings created another quiet social routine. Neighbors exchanged news, discussed local concerns, and shared the everyday rhythm of the community. Sanitation, while not perfect by modern standards, was also part of this organized urban routine. Public latrines existed in many Roman cities and were often connected to drainage systems that carried waste away. These spaces were communal and practical. Visitors sat side by side on stone seats with running water channels beneath. While this might sound unusual today, for Romans it was simply another normal part of daily life. Like the baths and markets, these facilities reflected the Roman belief that public infrastructure should support the functioning of society. The soundscape of Rome also played a role in shaping daily routine. Ancient writers sometimes described the city as overwhelmingly noisy. During daylight hours, the streets were full of voices, merchants advertising their goods, animals moving through the roads, craftsmen working with metal and wood, and crowds moving toward markets or public spaces. A person walking through Rome would hear the clatter of tools, the rumble of carts in permitted areas, the laughter of children, and the constant hum of negotiation and conversation. For residents of crowded apartment buildings, these sounds rarely disappeared completely. Thin walls and shared spaces meant neighbors were always close. The Roman poet Juvenal famously complained about the difficulty of sleeping in such conditions, describing the noise of traffic and shouting that continued long after sunset. While his description may have been exaggerated for effect, it still reflects how lively and densely packed the city could be. Workshops formed another steady part of the urban routine. Many trades operated directly along the street so customers could easily see the work being done. Blacksmiths hammered metal tools and weapons. Fullers cleaned and processed cloth using chemical treatments and large vats. Potters shaped clay vessels that would later be used for cooking, storage, and trade across the empire. Each craft followed its own daily rhythm, yet together they created a network of economic activity that supported Roman society. In port cities such as Ostia, the routine included the arrival and departure of ships carrying grain, olive oil, wine, and other goods from across the Mediterranean. Dockworkers unloaded cargo while merchants recorded shipments and arranged transportation inland. Warehouses stored enormous quantities of food and supplies that would eventually reach the markets of Rome. The movement of these goods was not random. It followed organized patterns designed to ensure the capital remained supplied with essential resources. Despite the scale of the empire, daily life often remained very local. Most people spent the majority of their time within a limited part of the city or countryside. They knew the same shopkeepers, neighbors, and public spaces, and their routines revolved around familiar streets and buildings. This local stability helped create a sense of belonging even in a city that could hold more than 1 million residents. At the same time, reminders of the wider empire were everywhere. Coins carried the image of the emperor. Soldiers might pass through the streets. Traders spoke different languages or wore clothing from distant provinces. Goods from Egypt, Spain, Gaul, and Syria appeared in Roman markets. Through these small encounters, ordinary citizens were constantly reminded that their daily routines were connected to a vast imperial network. And so the Roman day, with all its familiar activities, work, bathing, eating, conversation, rest, was never just personal routine. It was part of a much larger system that linked neighborhoods, cities, and provinces together across thousands of miles. As we reach the final picture of a Roman day, what becomes most striking is how ordinary routines quietly supported an extraordinary empire. Rome is often remembered for conquest, monumental buildings, and powerful emperors. Yet the true foundation of Roman civilization was far less dramatic. It was built on habits repeated every morning, every afternoon, and every evening by millions of people across the Mediterranean world. Imagine the empire waking at dawn. In Britain, soldiers stationed along the northern frontier rise early to begin their duties. In North Africa, farmers step into their fields while the air is still cool. In Italy, bakers light their ovens and prepare bread for the city markets. Although these people live thousands of miles apart, their days follow patterns shaped by Roman customs, Roman law, and Roman infrastructure. The empire did not operate only through authority from the capital. It functioned because daily life itself had become organized around shared expectations. These expectations touched nearly every aspect of life. Work began early because daylight was valuable. Public spaces like forums and markets provided places where economic and social activity could gather. Bathhouses offered not only hygiene but conversation and connection. Evening meals brought households together and reinforced family structure. Religious rituals, whether private offerings at household shrines or larger public ceremonies, reminded Romans that their lives were part of a larger cosmic order watched over by the gods. Routine also helped preserve Roman identity. Over time, people from many cultures adopted Roman customs, clothing styles, language, and legal systems. This process did not erase local traditions, but it blended them into a shared framework that historians often call Romanization. A merchant in Gaul or a landowner in Spain might still maintain regional traditions, yet the rhythm of daily life, markets, baths, meals, civic duties, looked recognizably Roman. This shared routine helped create stability in a world without modern communication. Messages traveled slowly by foot, horse, or ship. News of distant events might take weeks or months to arrive. In such a system, daily structure mattered greatly. If local communities understood how society was supposed to function, They could maintain order even when central authority was far away. Routine became a kind of cultural glue that held the empire together. Of course, Roman life was not always peaceful or predictable. Political struggles, economic pressures, and social inequality shaped many lives in difficult ways. Some people benefited greatly from the system, while others faced harsh conditions or limited freedom. Yet even during times of uncertainty, the basic rhythm of daily life often continued. Markets opened, bread was baked, baths were heated, and families gathered for their evening meals. Archaeology gives us many quiet glimpses of these ordinary moments. In Pompeii, preserved streets still show the small food counters where customers once ordered hot meals. Household shrines remain in place where families offered prayers to their protective spirits. Graffiti scratched into walls reveal jokes, announcements, and everyday concerns. These small traces remind us that behind the grand narrative of Roman history lived countless individuals whose lives were shaped not by dramatic events, but by simple daily routines. And in many ways, those routines feel surprisingly familiar. People woke early, worked to support their families, met friends in shared public spaces, and gathered for meals at the end of the day. They worried about reputation, community, and opportunity. Even across 2,000 years of distance, these patterns still resonate because they reflect basic human needs: structure, connection, and belonging. So when we think about ancient Rome, it can be helpful to shift our perspective slightly. Instead of imagining only emperors and armies, picture a baker opening his shop before sunrise, a group of neighbors talking beside a fountain, workers finishing their tasks and heading toward the baths, families sharing food by lamplight as evening settles across the city. Those moments, repeated across generations, formed the true heartbeat of Roman civilization. And tomorrow morning, just like today, the rhythm would begin again. If we linger a little longer in this Roman day, another quiet but important part of daily life begins to appear: the role of community and neighborhood familiarity. In large Roman cities, people did not experience the entire urban landscape every day. Instead, their lives were centered around a small network of streets, shops, fountains, and public spaces that formed their immediate world. Within that space, people recognized faces, knew local vendors, and understood the small routines that shaped neighborhood life. A typical Roman street was far more active than the silent ruins we see today. Shops opened directly onto the road, often with wide doorways that allowed merchants to display their goods to passers-by. Bakers stacked fresh bread in view of customers. Wine cellars kept large jars ready for quick servings. Vendors offered olives, fruit, cooked meals, or small household items. The street itself functioned almost like an open-air marketplace where daily necessities could be purchased within walking distance of home. Children grew up surrounded by this lively environment. They learned the habits of their community simply by observing the adults around them. They watched traders bargain over prices, listened to political discussions in public squares, and accompanied family members to baths, markets, or religious shrines. Through these everyday experiences, children gradually absorbed the unwritten rules that defined Roman society. Education, when available, often took place in small informal settings rather than large institutions. A teacher might gather students in a rented room, a shaded courtyard, or even a corner of a public space. There they practiced reading, writing, and arithmetic using wax tablets or simple writing materials. Wealthier families sometimes hired private tutors who instructed children at home. In either case, education was closely tied to daily routine. Lessons happened in the morning, often before the heat of the afternoon, and students returned home afterward to rejoin the rhythm of family life. Another important feature of Roman daily routine was personal grooming and appearance. Cleanliness mattered socially, and grooming habits reflected a person's status and discipline. Visits to barbers were common, especially for men. Barber shops could become small centers of conversation where customers discussed news, politics, and neighborhood events while waiting their turn. Haircuts, beard trimming, and even simple medical procedures might take place in these modest establishments. Women's grooming routines could be more complex, particularly among the elite. Hairstyles were carefully arranged, sometimes involving elaborate braids or decorative pins. Cosmetics, perfumes, and jewelry signaled wealth and taste. Enslaved attendants often assisted with these preparations in wealthy households. For ordinary women, grooming remained simpler but still meaningful, reflecting pride in appearance and participation in social expectations. As the day moved forward, the Roman city continued to flow with movement. Messengers carried documents between offices. Craftsmen delivered finished goods to customers. Farmers arriving from nearby countryside markets brought produce to sell. Each activity seemed small on its own, but together they formed a constant circulation of people and goods. One reason this system worked so well was Rome's remarkable road network. Inside cities, paved streets allowed carts and pedestrians to move more easily through busy districts. Beyond the city walls, long stone roads connected towns, military forts, and trading centers across the empire. Travelers could move with surprising efficiency for the ancient world, stopping at inns or way stations along the route. News, letters, and goods traveled along these roads, linking distant regions into a shared economic and political system. And yet, for most Romans, the empire still felt personal rather than distant. The vast territory ruled from Rome did not dominate everyday thought. Instead, life unfolded through familiar routines. Greeting neighbors, visiting shops, completing work, attending baths, sharing meals. Through these simple actions, individuals experienced the empire not as an abstract power, but as a living environment surrounding them. By the time night arrived again, lamps were lit, doors closed, and voices softened across the neighborhoods of the city. Another Roman day had passed, one built not from dramatic events, but from small repeated habits that shaped the lives of millions. And as the quiet hours deepened and sleep settled across the streets, everyone knew that with the first light of morning, the same familiar rhythm would begin once more. If we follow the Roman day one step further into the broader countryside, we begin to see how different daily routines could look beyond the crowded streets of the capital. While cities like Rome, Pompeii, and Ostia are often the focus of historical discussion, the majority of people in the Roman world actually lived in rural communities. For these families, the rhythm of the day was shaped less by markets and bathhouses and more by the cycles of agriculture. A rural Roman morning often began even earlier than in the city. Farmers rose before sunrise to take advantage of the cooler hours of the day. The work that followed depended heavily on the season. In spring, fields might be prepared for planting grain, olives, or grapes. During summer, long hours were spent maintaining crops, repairing tools, and caring for livestock. Autumn brought the intense labor of harvest, when entire households participated in gathering grain, pressing olives into oil, or crushing grapes to produce wine. Winter, although quieter, still required attention to animals, equipment, and storage supplies. Agriculture in the Roman world was organized around both small family farms and large estates, known as latifundia. On small farms, families worked the land themselves, often with only a few hired laborers or assistants. These farmers lived close to their fields, and their daily routine followed the needs of the land. Weather conditions, soil quality, and seasonal changes all influenced how the day unfolded. Large estates operated differently. Wealthy landowners sometimes controlled vast areas of farmland worked by enslaved laborers or tenant farmers. Overseers managed daily operations, ensuring that planting, harvesting, and storage were completed efficiently. In these environments, the routine of labor could be extremely demanding, especially during busy agricultural seasons. Yet even here, the structure of the day followed a familiar rhythm. Early rising, hours of physical work, a midday pause for food, and continued labor until evening. Food production in these rural regions supported the entire Roman system. Grain from provinces such as Egypt and North Africa fed the enormous population of Rome itself. Olive oil from Spain and Greece traveled across the Mediterranean in large clay containers called amphorae. Wine production flourished in Italy, Gaul, and many other regions. These goods moved through complex trade networks, eventually appearing in city markets where urban residents purchased their daily supplies. Despite the hard work required, rural communities often developed strong local traditions. Small villages gathered for seasonal festivals, religious ceremonies, and market days that broke the routine of agricultural labor. Temples dedicated to local deities stood alongside shrines honoring the wider Roman pantheon. Through these events, rural populations remained connected both to their immediate neighbors and to the broader culture of the empire. Communication between countryside and city was constant. Farmers traveled to nearby towns to sell produce, purchase tools, or resolve legal matters. Traders moved goods along Roman roads, linking villages to regional markets. Even in remote areas, the influence of Roman administration was visible through tax collection, military presence, and the spread of Latin language and customs. Interestingly, while city life included baths, crowded housing, and busy streets, rural life offered something different: space and quiet. Homes were often built around courtyards or small farms where daily activities took place outdoors. Families worked together, shared meals, and relied on practical knowledge passed down through generations. The pace could still be demanding, but the environment was shaped by fields, animals, and the movement of the seasons rather than the constant noise of urban traffic. Even so, rural routines still connected closely with the larger Roman world. Coins used in markets carried imperial images. Laws governing land ownership came from Roman authority. Roads maintained by the empire allowed farmers to transport goods efficiently. In this way, even a quiet farm far from the capital remained part of a vast and interconnected system. As evening approached in these countryside communities, the end of the day looked surprisingly similar to what happened in the city. Families gathered for their main meal. Lamps were lit as darkness spread across the fields, and conversation replaced the long hours of work. The quiet of the countryside settled in, broken only by distant animal sounds or the wind moving through crops. And just like in Rome itself, the people living in these rural landscapes understood that tomorrow would bring the same familiar rhythm. Another day of labor, community, and routine that helped sustain the empire from the ground up. As we look across the full landscape of the Roman world, one final element of the daily routine becomes clear: the importance of habit in maintaining a stable society. Rome did not rely solely on power from its emperors or the strength of its armies. What allowed such a vast empire to function for centuries was the quiet repetition of familiar patterns in everyday life. A Roman citizen waking up in the city of Rome, a trader in a provincial town, and a farmer in the countryside all experienced different environments. Yet their days still followed recognizable rhythms shaped by Roman culture. They woke early with the light of the sun. Work occupied most of the morning hours. Public spaces, markets, forums, fountains, and baths provided places for interaction. Evening meals gathered families and friends together before the quiet of night returned. These routines created something deeply important: predictability. In a world without modern communication systems, predictable behavior allowed society to function smoothly. Merchants knew when markets would open. Officials knew when the forum would fill with citizens seeking decisions or assistance. Craftsmen expected customers at certain times of day. Even religious ceremonies followed established calendars that organized the year into familiar cycles. The Roman calendar itself was a powerful organizing tool. Festivals honoring the gods appeared throughout the year, marking agricultural seasons, historical victories, and traditional celebrations. During these festivals, daily routines shifted slightly. Work might pause, temples filled with offerings, and crowds gathered for games or ceremonies. Yet these interruptions were themselves predictable. Everyone knew when they would arrive, and they became part of the larger rhythm of Roman time. Public entertainment also contributed to this shared routine. In large cities, people attended theatrical performances, chariot races, or other spectacles held in massive arenas. The Circus Maximus, for example, could hold enormous crowds eager to watch chariot races that stirred excitement across the city. Spectators supported different racing teams, and conversations about recent competitions often spread through neighborhoods and marketplaces. However, even these dramatic spectacles eventually returned to the quieter patterns of daily life. Once the races ended or the performance finished, people walked home along the same streets they traveled every day. Shops closed their doors, lamps were lit, and families gathered again inside their homes. Another steady presence within Roman routine was the military. Soldiers stationed in cities or along frontier regions also followed carefully structured daily schedules. Training exercises, equipment maintenance, patrol duties, and administrative tasks filled their time. Roman military discipline was famous for its organization, and the routines practiced within army camps reflected the same broader Roman values of order and responsibility. These soldiers, stationed across distant provinces, helped spread Roman customs wherever they lived. Veterans often settled in new communities after completing their service, bringing Roman habits, language, and traditions with them. Over time, this movement of people strengthened the cultural connections that held the empire together. When historians study ancient Rome, they often focus on major political turning points: the rise of emperors, the expansion of territory, or the crises that eventually weakened the empire. Yet beneath those dramatic moments existed something much quieter and more constant. The empire continued functioning because ordinary people continued their routines. The baker still woke before dawn to prepare bread. The merchant still opened his stall in the marketplace. Citizens still gathered at the baths in the afternoon. Families still shared their evening meals beneath the soft light of oil lamps. These simple actions may seem small, but together they created the steady rhythm that defined Roman life. Day after day, year after year, the same patterns repeated across cities, villages, and farms throughout the Mediterranean world. And in that steady repetition, Rome found one of its greatest strengths. The empire was not sustained only by power or ambition. It endured because millions of people understood their place within a familiar daily rhythm, a rhythm that quietly supported one of the most influential civilizations in human history. As night settled once more over the rooftops of Rome, the streets slowly grew calm. Lamps flickered behind doorways, conversations faded, and families prepared for sleep. And somewhere in the darkness, ovens were already being prepared for the morning's bread, ready for the next Roman day to begin again. If we pause for a moment and imagine standing in the city of Rome just before dawn, we can begin to see how these routines created a sense of continuity across generations. The same streets that carried merchants and laborers during one century carried them again in the next. Buildings were repaired, rebuilt, and expanded, but the rhythm of the day remained recognizable. A Roman living in the first century and another living generations later would still understand the structure of the day in familiar ways. This continuity was strengthened by Roman attitudes toward tradition, something they called mos maiorum, meaning the customs of the ancestors. Romans believed that the habits and practices passed down from earlier generations contained wisdom. Respecting these traditions was not simply a matter of nostalgia. It was considered a responsible way to preserve social stability. In daily life, this meant that routines were valued and repeated deliberately. For example, the structure of family life reflected these traditions. The Roman household was organized around the authority of the paterfamilias, the senior male who legally represented the family. His role included managing property, arranging marriages, and overseeing the welfare of the household. While this authority could vary in practice, the expectation itself shaped daily behavior. Family members participated in shared meals, religious rituals, and responsibilities that reinforced the household's unity. Household religion played a small but meaningful role in this routine. Many Roman homes included a shrine dedicated to the Lares and Penates, protective spirits believed to watch over the family and its food supply. Offerings might be made before meals or during special occasions. These rituals were often brief, yet they created a daily reminder that family life was connected to spiritual protection and tradition. Over time, the routine of the Roman day also helped people navigate the complexity of a massive and diverse empire. Within the capital alone, residents might encounter people from many regions: traders from the eastern Mediterranean, soldiers from distant provinces, artisans who had migrated in search of opportunity. Despite this diversity, the structure of daily life created a common framework that allowed people to interact smoothly. Markets followed predictable hours. Bathhouses opened and closed according to familiar schedules. Public officials received visitors in the morning. Legal matters were discussed in the forum during established times of day. Even the pattern of meals, light breakfast, small midday food, and a larger evening dinner was widely recognized. These shared expectations made urban life more manageable despite the scale and variety of the population. Seasonal celebrations also helped maintain continuity within Roman society. Certain days of the year were marked by festivals honoring gods such as Saturn, Jupiter, or Mars. During these celebrations, the usual routines could temporarily change. Work might pause, decorations appeared in homes and temples, and people gathered in public spaces for feasting and games. One well-known festival, Saturnalia, even reversed some social roles for a short period, allowing servants and masters to share in festive customs together. Yet even these unusual celebrations eventually returned to normal patterns. Once the festival ended, the familiar rhythm of daily life resumed. Bakers reopened their shops before sunrise, traders returned to their stalls, and bathhouses once again filled with afternoon visitors. The temporary excitement of festivals actually highlighted how stable the ordinary routine usually was. This stability allowed Rome to absorb change without losing its identity. New provinces were added, different cultures joined the empire, and technologies evolved. But the everyday structure of life, morning work, social interaction in public spaces, evening meals with family, remained recognizable for centuries. Archaeological discoveries continue to reveal traces of these repeated habits. Footprints worn into stone streets show where thousands of pedestrians once walked the same paths. Counters in ancient food shops still display the circular openings where jars of prepared meals were kept warm for customers. Public bath complexes reveal the careful layout of rooms designed to guide visitors through the same sequence of activities every day. Each of these physical remains represents a routine repeated countless times. Someone once stood at that counter ordering food. Someone else walked those streets on the way to work or to meet friends at the baths. Another family gathered around a table under lamplight to share their evening meal. These small, ordinary actions rarely appear in grand historical narratives. Yet together they created the living structure of Roman civilization. Without them, the empire's armies, laws, and monuments would have stood on fragile ground. And so, as another Roman evening settled quietly over the city, the familiar rhythm prepared to begin once again, just as it had the day before, and just as it would the day after that. As the Roman night deepened and most households settled into sleep, the empire itself never truly became still. Even in the quiet hours, certain systems continued to operate in ways that supported the next day's routine. In large cities especially, the preparation for tomorrow often began while much of the population rested. Bakeries are a good example of this quiet nighttime activity. Bread was one of the most essential foods in the Roman diet, and in a city the size of Rome, the demand was enormous. Many bakeries worked during the night so that fresh loaves would be ready when the city woke. Mills powered by animals or enslaved labor ground grain into flour. Ovens were heated long before sunrise, and workers shaped dough that would soon appear in neighborhood shops. When morning arrived, citizens walking through the streets could buy warm bread almost immediately. What seemed like a simple morning purchase was actually the result of hours of unseen work. Transportation also took advantage of the nighttime hours. Roman authorities sometimes restricted heavy cart traffic during the day because narrow streets could become dangerously crowded. As a result, many deliveries happened after sunset. Wagons carrying food, building materials, or goods from distant provinces moved through the city when fewer pedestrians were present. Ancient writers occasionally complained about the noise of these nighttime carts rolling across stone roads. But this system allowed the city to remain supplied without completely overwhelming daytime movement. Beyond the city walls, the wider empire was also preparing for the next day. Along major Roman roads, travelers rested in roadside inns or small stations known as mansions, which were maintained for official messengers and government couriers. These stations allowed messages to travel across vast distances more efficiently. While communication was still slow compared with modern standards, the Roman road network created a surprisingly reliable system for moving information and goods between provinces. In military forts along distant frontiers, soldiers followed carefully organized routines even during the night. Guards stood watch on walls and towers, maintaining security for the camp and surrounding region. Patrols might move quietly along defensive boundaries, checking for signs of trouble. Inside the fort, other soldiers slept in shared barracks, ready to resume training, construction, or administrative tasks when morning arrived. Military discipline ensured that the army remained prepared at all hours. Back in the city, the deeper hours of the night were perhaps the closest Rome came to silence. Oil lamps burned low inside homes, their soft light illuminating small rooms where families slept closely together. The sounds of the daytime marketplace were gone, replaced by distant footsteps, the occasional call of a night watchman, or the creaking of a cart finishing its deliveries. For many Romans, these quiet hours were precious simply because they offered rest from the intensity of daily life. Urban living could be crowded and demanding. Apartment buildings held many families in limited space, and the constant movement of people during daylight hours left little room for privacy. Night provided a pause, a moment when the pressures of work, trade, and social obligations temporarily faded. Yet even this rest was closely connected to the larger rhythm of Roman routine. Because the day began early, sleep was essential preparation for the morning ahead. When the first faint light appeared along the horizon, the city would gradually awaken again. Bakers would already have bread ready for sale. Market vendors would begin arranging their goods. Patrons would prepare to receive their clients. Workers would step back into the streets, joining the steady flow of movement that defined Roman life. This cycle repeated not just for days, but for years and generations. A child growing up in Rome learned these patterns almost without thinking. They understood when shops opened, when the baths filled with visitors, and when families gathered for the evening meal. As they grew older, they took their place within that same rhythm, contributing to the countless small actions that kept the city alive. And this is perhaps the most remarkable thing about the Roman daily routine. It was not designed by a single ruler or written into a strict schedule. Instead, it developed gradually through tradition, necessity, and shared habits. Over time, these habits became so familiar that they shaped the identity of Roman society itself. Empires are often remembered for dramatic moments, victories, rebellions, and the rise of powerful leaders. But those moments are only brief interruptions in a much longer story. The true foundation of Rome was built through ordinary days, repeated quietly across homes, streets, farms, and provinces. Each morning began with the same light over the rooftops. Each afternoon brought the sounds of work and conversation. Each evening gathered families together beneath the glow of oil lamps. And through this steady rhythm, day after day, the world of ancient Rome continued to move forward. If we take one final, slow look at the Roman daily routine, what stands out most clearly is how deeply human it feels, even across 2,000 years of distance. The buildings, clothing, and technologies may appear ancient to us, but the rhythm of the day still follows patterns that people everywhere recognize. Romans woke up with the morning light, prepared food, worked to support their households, interacted with neighbors and colleagues, and returned home in the evening to rest. This familiarity is one reason the Roman world continues to fascinate historians. When we read the writings of Roman authors or examine the remains of cities like Pompeii, we do not only see the grand structures of empire. We see the traces of ordinary people moving through ordinary days. Footpaths worn into stone streets show where thousands of residents walked the same routes to markets or baths. Small household kitchens reveal where meals were prepared for families. Even graffiti scratched onto walls captures moments of humor, announcements, and personal expression. These small details remind us that Rome was not just an empire of rulers and armies. It was a society filled with bakers, teachers, merchants, farmers, craftsmen, parents, and children, each of them living through the same sequence of daily routines that shaped their lives. The Roman routine also reveals something about the values of the culture itself. Discipline, responsibility, and respect for tradition were strongly emphasized. People were expected to fulfill their roles within family and society. Public behavior mattered. Reputation mattered. Even simple acts, such as greeting a patron in the morning or participating in community events, reinforced a sense that individuals were part of a larger social structure. At the same time, Roman life was full of adaptation and change. The empire expanded across vast regions that included deserts, mountains, forests, and coastlines. Local customs blended with Roman practices, creating variations in how daily life looked from one province to another. A merchant in Alexandria might begin his day differently than a farmer in Gaul or a soldier stationed in Britain. Yet the broader rhythm of Roman culture still connected them. Food markets sold goods transported across the Mediterranean. Coins carried the image of the emperor in distant provinces. Soldiers built roads and forts that linked communities thousands of miles apart. Through these connections, even the smallest daily routine, buying bread, attending the baths, sharing an evening meal, became part of a larger imperial system. Archaeologists often describe ancient cities as snapshots frozen in time, and places like Pompeii give us a rare opportunity to see the Roman routine almost exactly as it once was. Shops remain filled with storage jars. Street crossings still show the raised stones that helped pedestrians avoid muddy roads. Public baths preserve the sequence of rooms where people once gathered to wash, relax, and talk. Standing in those spaces today, it becomes easier to imagine the rhythm of life that once filled them. Early morning footsteps echoing through narrow streets. The smell of bread baking in neighborhood ovens. Voices rising in crowded markets as merchants advertised their goods. The warm steam of the baths in the late afternoon. Lamps glowing softly in homes as families gathered for dinner. These are not dramatic historical events, yet they are the true heartbeat of Roman civilization. Empires rise through ambition and power, but they endure through routine. The Roman Empire lasted for centuries not simply because of its military strength or political organization, but because daily life worked. Food arrived in markets. Water flowed through aqueducts. Roads connected distant regions. Social customs guided how people interacted with one another. And most importantly, millions of individuals woke up each morning and followed the same familiar rhythm that held their society together. So when we imagine ancient Rome, it may help to picture something quieter than the triumphal arches and the marching legions. Imagine a narrow street at sunrise, a shopkeeper lifting the wooden shutters of his stall, a neighbor greeting a friend on the way to the fountain. The city slowly waking as the first light spreads across rooftops. Another Roman day has begun, and for the people who lived it, that simple routine repeated again and again was the foundation of one of the most remarkable civilizations in human history. And if we follow that sunrise once more across the rooftops of Rome, the familiar rhythm begins again almost effortlessly. A faint light spreads over tiled roofs, narrow alleys, and quiet courtyards. The city, which only hours earlier seemed almost completely still, slowly returns to motion. Doors open, sandals strike stone streets, and another ordinary Roman day quietly begins. For the people who lived here, this repetition did not feel monotonous. Instead, it created a dependable structure to life. In a world without digital schedules, electric lighting, or instant communication, routine itself served as a kind of invisible framework. Everyone understood the flow of the day. Bakers worked before sunrise. Merchants opened their stalls in the morning. Officials received visitors early. Bathhouses filled later in the afternoon. Families gathered together for the evening meal. This shared understanding allowed a city as enormous and complicated as Rome to function with surprising coordination. When people stepped into the streets each morning, they already knew roughly what the day would bring. The rhythm was not imposed strictly by government order. It had grown gradually over generations through habit, necessity, and shared expectations. Even the architecture of Roman cities reflected this rhythm. Streets were designed to guide movement toward marketplaces and public forums. Water fountains were placed where neighborhoods needed them most. Bathhouses stood within easy walking distance for large populations. These structures were not just symbols of Roman engineering. They were practical spaces designed to support everyday routines. Take the Roman Forum, for example. To modern visitors, it appears as a collection of ruins surrounded by ancient columns. But in its own time, the Forum was alive with movement from the early morning onward. Citizens came to conduct business, hear legal cases, make political announcements, and exchange news. Vendors sold goods nearby, messengers delivered documents, and visitors passed through on their way to temples or government buildings. The Forum functioned almost like the central heartbeat of the city. Meanwhile, the public baths served a different role in the rhythm of the day. If the Forum represented public duty and civic life, the baths represented relaxation and social connection. By late afternoon, bathhouses filled with people seeking not only cleanliness but also conversation. Friends met there regularly. Business discussions continued in warm chambers filled with steam. Philosophical debates, casual gossip, and practical negotiations all unfolded within the same shared spaces. In this way, Roman routine balanced work, social life, and rest. The early part of the day emphasized productivity and responsibility. The afternoon allowed space for relaxation and interaction. The evening returned people to the household, where family relationships remained central to daily life. The Roman household itself was more than just a place to sleep. It was where children learned customs, where family traditions were preserved, and where economic planning often took place. Even modest homes served as centers of daily organization. Meals were prepared, clothing repaired, accounts discussed, and plans made for the following day. Over years and decades, these repeated patterns became deeply ingrained in Roman culture. A child growing up in the empire would naturally learn when shops opened, when workers returned from their tasks, and when the city quieted for the night. By the time that child reached adulthood, these rhythms felt almost instinctive. And this instinctive routine helped bind together an empire stretching from the Atlantic Ocean to the deserts of the Middle East. People across these distant regions might speak different languages or follow local traditions, yet they participated in a shared pattern of daily life shaped by Roman influence. A traveler moving from one Roman city to another could recognize familiar structures almost immediately. There would be a central forum, a marketplace, bathhouses, temples, and streets organized in predictable ways. The sounds of the morning, the bustle of midday commerce, and the calm of evening meals would feel strangely recognizable. This familiarity created a sense of unity that extended beyond political control. Rome was not simply a government ruling distant lands. It was also a cultural rhythm, repeated day after day in towns and cities throughout the empire. And perhaps that is why studying the Roman daily routine is so revealing. When historians look beyond wars and emperors, they discover something quieter but equally powerful: the countless ordinary moments that sustained Roman civilization. The baker lighting his oven before dawn, the merchant arranging goods in the marketplace, neighbors meeting beside a public fountain, friends gathering in the warm rooms of the baths, families sharing food by the soft glow of an oil lamp. Each of these small scenes happened thousands of times across the Roman world. None of them seemed extraordinary to the people living them. Yet together they formed the living structure of an empire that shaped history for centuries. And so, as the sun climbs higher over the ancient streets, the city moves forward once again, carried not by grand events, but by the quiet strength of everyday life. As the sun continues to rise over the ancient city, the streets of Rome gradually fill with life once again. The early quiet gives way to movement as shopkeepers sweep the front of their stalls, vendors prepare their goods, and the steady flow of pedestrians begins. In many neighborhoods, the first sounds of the day are practical ones: the scrape of wooden shutters opening, the clatter of pottery being arranged for sale, and the voices of neighbors exchanging greetings as they pass. This early hour was one of the most productive parts of the Roman day. The air was cooler, the streets easier to navigate, and people were focused on the tasks ahead. For merchants and craftsmen, the morning represented opportunity. Customers arrived looking for food, tools, clothing, or household supplies. Bakers displayed fresh loaves that had been prepared overnight, while fruit sellers arranged baskets of figs, grapes, or apples depending on the season. Markets were more than places to buy and sell. They were centers of information and conversation. News traveled through ordinary exchanges between buyers and sellers. A merchant might mention the arrival of ships from a distant province. A traveler could describe conditions on the roads or events happening in another city. These small conversations formed the communication network of the Roman world, spreading knowledge gradually through daily contact. At the same time, the administrative life of the city was beginning. Officials and clerks gathered in public buildings where records were kept and legal matters handled. Citizens who needed to settle disputes or present petitions often came early, knowing that business was most easily conducted in the morning hours. The Roman legal system relied heavily on personal appearance and spoken arguments, which meant that public spaces often filled with people waiting for their turn to speak or observe proceedings. Education also fit naturally into this morning rhythm. In wealthier households, tutors guided students through lessons in reading, writing, and rhetoric. These subjects were considered essential for anyone who hoped to participate in public life. Boys practiced copying letters onto wax tablets, memorizing speeches, and studying works of literature that were believed to develop character and discipline. In more modest circumstances, learning could happen in simpler settings. Teachers might gather small groups of students in rented rooms or shaded outdoor areas. The environment was not always quiet or formal. Street noise and passing crowds could easily interrupt a lesson, but education still remained a valued part of daily life for those who could pursue it. Meanwhile, in workshops across the city, craftsmen were already deeply engaged in their trades. The Roman economy depended heavily on skilled labor. Metal workers forged tools, nails, and decorative items. Potters shaped clay into vessels used for cooking and storage. Leather workers produced sandals, belts, and other everyday goods. Each workshop followed its own rhythm, but together they formed the productive backbone of the urban economy. As the sun climbed higher, the pace of the streets intensified. Messengers hurried through the crowds carrying documents between offices. Laborers transported materials to construction sites where buildings were constantly being repaired or expanded. Rome was a city that rarely stood still for long. New structures appeared, old ones were modified, and the physical landscape slowly evolved alongside the routines of its people. Yet, despite this activity, the structure of the Roman day remained remarkably balanced. Work dominated the early hours, but the culture also recognized the importance of rest and social interaction later in the day. By midday, many workers paused for a short meal or moment of relief from the heat. This brief break allowed energy to return before the afternoon continued. The afternoon, as we have seen, often brought people toward the bathhouses, places where the physical demands of the day softened into relaxation and conversation. There, beneath vaulted ceilings warmed by hidden heating systems, Romans washed away the dust of work and reconnected with friends, neighbors, and business partners. And when the baths closed and evening approached once more, families returned to their homes, lighting lamps and preparing for the evening meal. The city slowly quieted again, ready to repeat the same steady rhythm the following day. Through these countless cycles of ordinary activity, buying, selling, working, bathing, eating, and resting, the Roman world maintained its stability. The empire's greatness was not sustained only by emperors or generals, but by the reliable repetition of everyday life. And in that quiet repetition, day after day, Rome continued to live. As the day in Rome moved steadily toward its later hours, the city entered one of its most socially active periods. Work had filled much of the morning, but the afternoon allowed space for interaction, conversation, and the maintenance of relationships that were essential to Roman society. In many ways, this part of the day revealed how strongly the Romans valued community and shared public life. The streets near the bathhouses, marketplaces, and forums often became especially lively during these hours. Citizens who had completed their business earlier in the day now had time to meet acquaintances or conduct less formal discussions. In a society where reputation mattered greatly, simply being seen in the right places could reinforce a person's standing within the community. The Roman baths played a central role in this afternoon rhythm. For many residents, visiting the baths was almost as regular as eating or sleeping. Entry fees were often modest, and some emperors even sponsored free access to the baths for the public. This meant that people from a wide range of social backgrounds could gather in the same complex, sharing the same heated rooms and pools. Inside these bathhouses, the atmosphere was both practical and social. Visitors moved through the familiar sequence of rooms, changing areas, warm chambers, hot bathing rooms, and cold plunge pools. Yet the real activity often happened in conversation. Friends exchanged news about family matters, business opportunities, or political developments. Merchants arranged deals. Philosophers debated ideas. In this warm and relaxed environment, discussions could unfold more freely than in formal settings. Around the bathing areas were often exercise courtyards, where people participated in light physical activity before washing. Ball games, stretching, and simple athletic exercises were common. While Romans admired physical fitness, their approach to exercise was generally moderate compared with the intense athletic competitions of ancient Greece. The goal was not extreme performance but balance and health. Outside the baths, the rest of the city continued its own routines. Vendors still operated food stalls for people seeking quick meals. Travelers arriving from other regions might stop at inns or taverns to rest. Artisans finished the last stages of their daily work before closing their shops for the evening. The late afternoon light also changed the appearance of the city. Shadows lengthened across stone streets, and the intense heat of midday softened into a more comfortable warmth. For many Romans, this was the most pleasant part of the day, when the pressures of work had eased, but the city was still full of life. Gradually, attention turned toward the evening meal. Families returned to their homes carrying food purchased in the markets or prepared earlier in the day. In wealthier households, servants arranged dining rooms and prepared multiple dishes for guests. In more modest homes, cooking fires were lit for simple meals shared among family members. Despite differences in wealth and status, the evening meal was one of the few daily moments when the household gathered together. It provided time for conversation, reflection on the events of the day, and planning for the next morning. Children listened to stories or advice from their parents. Adults discussed business, family matters, or news heard earlier in the city. As darkness slowly spread across Rome, oil lamps were lit in homes and along certain streets. Their warm glow replaced the fading sunlight, creating small islands of light within the growing night. The energy of the day gradually softened. Shops closed their doors, the sounds of work disappeared, and voices became quieter as people settled into their homes. Yet even as the city grew calm, the structure of Roman life remained quietly in place. Everyone understood that the routine would soon begin again. With the next sunrise, the baker would prepare bread, merchants would reopen their stalls, and citizens would step back into the streets to repeat the familiar rhythm. Through this steady pattern, work in the morning, social life in the afternoon, family gatherings in the evening, the Roman world maintained a balance that sustained it for centuries. And as another night settled over the city's rooftops, Rome rested briefly before the next ordinary day began. As the evening deepened across the Roman city, the pace of life slowed in a way that felt almost deliberate. The noise of trade and work gradually faded, replaced by the quieter sounds of household life. Doors were closed, lamps were lit, and families settled into the final part of their day. In these hours, the Roman world shifted from public activity back into the private sphere of the home. Inside many houses, the soft glow of oil lamps illuminated rooms that had been busy since sunrise. These lamps were simple objects, small clay or metal containers filled with oil and fitted with a wick, but they were essential for extending activity after dark. Their light was not particularly bright, so evening tasks were usually calm and limited. People spoke quietly, finished small household chores, or simply rested after the long hours of the day. For families, the evening meal remained one of the most important moments of connection. After the demands of work, travel, and public responsibilities, members of the household gathered together. Conversation during these meals could range from practical matters, such as planning the next day's work, to storytelling, advice, or discussion of events happening in the wider empire. In this way, the dinner table served not only as a place to eat, but also as a space where knowledge and traditions were passed between generations. Children often heard stories about Roman history, famous leaders, or family ancestors. Romans believed strongly in the value of remembering the past, and these stories helped reinforce cultural values such as loyalty, courage, and respect for authority. Even in modest households, where food might be simple and space-limited, these moments of shared conversation played a powerful role in shaping identity. Beyond the household, some parts of the city remained active. Taverns and inns continued serving travelers and residents who wished to spend more time outside their homes. These establishments offered wine, simple food, and a place to relax after the day's work. While elite writers sometimes criticized taverns as noisy or disorderly, they were an ordinary and accepted part of Roman social life. For many working people, they provided a chance to unwind, talk with friends, and share news before returning home. Street lighting in ancient Rome was limited, so the city after dark felt very different from the brightly lit urban environments we know today. Only certain areas had lamps placed outside buildings, and most streets relied on the light spilling from doorways or windows. Because of this, movement at night was more cautious. People usually stayed within familiar neighborhoods, and many preferred to return home before the darkness became too deep. At intervals through the night, watchmen and guards patrolled parts of the city. Their role was to discourage theft, respond to fires, and maintain a sense of security. Fire was a constant concern in Roman cities because many buildings contained wooden structures and open flames used for cooking or lighting. Patrols helped watch for signs of danger while the majority of residents slept. Eventually, most of the city settled into quiet. In apartment buildings and houses alike, families prepared for sleep. Bedding was arranged, lamps were dimmed or extinguished, and conversations faded into silence. Because the next day would begin early, rest was necessary. Even in sleep, the structure of Roman life continued to operate around them. Bakers were already preparing grain for grinding. Carts carrying supplies might move through certain streets. Soldiers on watch stood alert along walls and gates. The empire never completely stopped moving. It simply slowed for a few hours before the next cycle began. And when the first faint light appeared again above the rooftops, the process would repeat almost exactly as it had the day before. The city would wake, the streets would fill, and the familiar rhythm of Roman daily life would begin once more. Through countless repetitions of this simple cycle, morning work, afternoon gathering, evening rest, the Roman world sustained itself across centuries. Empires may be remembered for their monuments and victories, but their true endurance often lies in something quieter: the steady, reliable routines of everyday life. If we imagine that first light returning again over Rome, the cycle of daily life begins almost exactly as it has for countless mornings before. The sky gradually brightens, shadows shorten along the stone streets, and the city slowly awakens. Somewhere a door opens, then another. The quiet of night gives way to footsteps, voices, and the familiar sounds of work beginning again. For many Romans, the morning carried a sense of purpose. It was the time when energy was highest and responsibilities were clearest. A craftsman might step into his workshop and begin shaping metal or leather. A merchant would prepare goods for customers, arranging them where they could easily be seen from the street. Farmers arriving from nearby countryside markets might unload baskets of produce that had been harvested only hours earlier. The streets themselves became part of this daily routine. Roman roads inside cities were often paved with stone and carefully constructed to manage drainage and foot traffic. Raised stepping stones allowed pedestrians to cross streets even when rain or wastewater flowed along the road's surface. These small architectural details reveal how carefully Roman cities were designed to support the movement of large numbers of people. As citizens moved through the city, public fountains served as regular stopping points. These fountains provided drinking water and also supplied households that did not have private connections to the aqueduct system. Residents carried clay jars to collect water for cooking and cleaning, and brief conversations often happened as neighbors waited their turn. In this way, even simple daily tasks created moments of social interaction. Meanwhile, animals were also part of the urban rhythm. Donkeys and mules transported goods between neighborhoods. In some areas, small livestock could be seen moving through streets on their way to markets. Although Rome was a major urban center, it never fully separated itself from the agricultural world that supported it. The presence of animals, grain deliveries, and produce carts constantly reminded citizens that their food and resources came from surrounding lands and distant provinces. For many Romans, clothing and personal presentation were also part of the morning routine. Garments were adjusted carefully before leaving the house because appearance influenced how others perceived a person's status. Even among ordinary citizens, neat clothing suggested discipline and respectability. In elite circles, these visual signals became even more important, with carefully arranged garments communicating rank and authority. As the morning progressed, the forum once again filled with activity. People gathered to discuss legal matters, conduct business, or simply observe the events unfolding around them. Public announcements might be delivered there, and political conversations were common. The forum functioned as a meeting point where the practical and social aspects of Roman life overlapped. Messengers moving through the forum carried documents between officials, merchants, and administrators. Written communication was essential in governing such a vast empire, and letters traveled frequently between cities and provinces. Although delivery could take time, The system allowed decisions made in Rome to gradually reach distant regions. Throughout the morning, the city maintained a steady momentum. Shops remained open, craftsmen continued their work, and travelers moved through gates and roads connecting Rome to the wider empire. Each of these activities seemed ordinary to the people participating in them. Yet together they formed a vast network of daily actions that sustained Roman society. What is remarkable is how predictable this rhythm became. Residents did not need written schedules or complex systems to know how their day would unfold. The habits of the city guided them. People knew when markets were busiest, when officials were available, and when it was time to return home. And so the Roman day unfolded again. Morning responsibilities gradually giving way to afternoon gatherings, bathhouse visits, and the quiet return to family life in the evening. From sunrise to sunset, the empire moved forward through these small repeated actions. Each citizen, merchant, farmer, or worker played a part in the same shared rhythm. And as long as that rhythm continued, Rome itself continued to live.